Day Saints, I hope that you're doing pretty well, and I hope that you find yourself enjoying this beautiful, beautiful day. And so, as you may know, we're now in the beginnings of the month of February. And one thing that I promised is that for everybody who's following the Bible Challenge, or for anybody who's just interested, that I would at the end of each month make a video that kind of covers what we covered in that past month. And you could use this video if you'd like to decide to catch up and join us wherever we are right now. And so here's this video, and I'm excited to share it with you. This month, being the first month of the year, is an exciting one because it's the month where we started the Bible. And so what we've done is that we've gone through the book of Genesis. We've also gone through the book of Exodus as well, and that took us through the month of January. And now we're a couple days into February, and we're through chapter 13 of Leviticus. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've read so far, what happened, what are some things to pay attention to. If you've done the reading or some of it, you can use this to compare to your own notes. If not, you can check it out if it's interesting to you. And if you'd like, I think it's totally cool to follow along, to listen to what I've said, to skim through a little bit, and then join us midway through Leviticus. But I'll have you use this however you will. But let's dive in and talk a little bit about what we've read so far. And so, as I said, we started off in Genesis, and Genesis starts off with two accounts of the creation story. Now, it's worth noting the first one is the Let There Be Light story, and then the second one involves Adam and Eve. And so, some people might say, do they conflict with each other? No, they don't really conflict with each other. The critical thing to know, though, is that as far as the narrative is concerned, the Adam and Eve story is the critical one. I say that because out of the Adam and Eve story, and eventually their son Seth and their son Cain as well, we get all the people of the earth, and we get those genealogies that are so important. And so we have Adam and Eve. We know the story hopefully pretty well, that they get banished from paradise. We get this explanation about, sort of why is there suffering in the world. It's very interesting to think about how the question of why there is suffering in the world, why things aren't perfect, why does childbirth hurt, why do we have to work so hard, that all those questions were answered literally within the first couple of chapters of the scripture. It kind of shows what people were really thinking about. And so we have Adam and Eve. They have two sons, Cain and Abel. There's a story about how Cain and Abel both offered sacrifices. It's interesting because Cain was the older one, Abel was the younger one. And we see immediately this dynamic between two sons, the older and the younger. Oftentimes, the younger ends up being chosen somehow. And so God regards Abel's sacrifice very well. God regards Cain's sacrifice not so well. Cain kills Abel, and he's banished. And so there we have it. We have the first murder just a couple chapters in. We also have sibling rivalry a couple chapters in. Both of these things will become up quite a bit in our scriptures. And so after the death of Abel, who was apparently the favorite one, they had Seth. And from Seth comes basically the majority of everyone else. And so we continue on, and we're with humanity at this point. And so now we're in chapter 6 of Genesis. What's interesting is that chapter 6 kind of paints a picture of lawless humanity. It talks about the Nephilim. Now, it talks about how there were angels and heavenly beings who would come to earth and would have children with humans, and their children would, live forever and have superpowers. And they talk about how these were the great giants and warriors of old. And so there's this sense that, early on, pretty much anything goes. And each time God responds with a punishment or a check on humanity some kind. And so in chapter 6, we hear about how, you have these folks who were giants and superheroes and everything, and they're living for hundreds and hundreds, almost thousands of years. And so God said at that point, okay, we're no longer going to allow people to live that long. We're going to say, human life should be 120 years, which is actually exactly how long Moses would live later on. And so that's interesting because if you look at these genealogies, you'll see that, when they talk about how long Adam lived, when they talk about how long Seth lived, when they talk about all these people, they lived hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And so that first check was to reduce the amount of years that people could live. So next we move on and we meet Noah. And once again, there's a lawlessness, which is interesting because there were no laws yet. But there's a lawlessness of the people. And so God sends the flood in order to start over. And so We have this great flood that comes, and we have the flood story. We know that pretty well. So out of that, after that, we get God's covenant with Noah. So this is the first sort of covenant and promise that we see. What's interesting about this covenant is that this covenant has God's responsibility or promise to not wipe everybody out again, but there aren't any pieces of it that have to do specifically with what the humans have to do. So far, the humans are kind of allowed to do their own thing. So we continue along. Another example of the lawlessness is we see this whole Tower of Babel phenomenon where people decide, hey, we're awesome, so we're going to build this great tower and everything's going to be amazing and we're going to be the rulers of everything. And God says, okay, I'm going to confuse their language and scatter them throughout the earth. Yes, this is an origin story about why we speak so many different languages, but it's also part of this thing where it starts off, God creates humans, and humans are left to their own devices, and apparently when left to their own devices, they don't do so well. And so God checks humanity once again. In chapter 12, we meet Abram, and this is really significant because Abram is considered, the father of God's people. And so we encounter Abram, we encounter his family, we see how he goes from Ur to Haran to eventually what was then Canaan, what becomes Israel. And we follow it along once again with issues between sons. In chapter 19, we run into the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is very significant in the sense that it's often referred to when they talk about raining hellfire and brimstone. And then we also get a picture of how the Bible treats rival tribes and nations of the Israelites. So, for example, in this chapter 19, we also see how Moab and Ammon, how these two nations that were closely related to Israel, how they were descended from Lot and his daughters. You see that here's where we see a pattern where you sort of write in your rivals into the family tree in ways that aren't terribly flattering. We actually saw that beforehand when looking at the descendants of Ham, of which are Cush and the Philistines, but I digress. And so we continue on dealing really with the drama around the family of Abraham. Chapter 27 is significant because that's where we meet Jacob, and this is where things really pick up because ultimately anyone who is a descendant of Jacob is considered part of the people, part of the nation, part of the 12 tribes. And so we have Jacob and his 12 sons. And then that continues along, and there still continued to be this whole idea of the younger prevailing over the older. And then finally in chapter 37, we get Joseph. And the whole story of Joseph is a fantastic story, but it's ultimately the story about how this group of people got to Egypt. Now, a little bit about that. There are many who argue that the people of Israel were actually a group of people that started in Egypt, and they didn't become a tribe or community until they left Egypt together and came to this place and started anew. I can let you determine what you think about that. But nonetheless, I say that because, so much of this story between Abram and especially with Joseph was about constructing how are we related to each other? How are we connected? And how do we get to Egypt? And why did we want to come back to this place? And so that takes us through the end of Genesis. Then we have Exodus. And Exodus has exactly that, the Exodus. Chapter 1 of Exodus, the oppression begins, which is pretty horrible. They're subjected to slavery. We meet Moses in chapter 2. And what's interesting, if you've seen the movie The Ten Commandments, between the beginning of chapter 2 and chapter 3 is where they fit like 90% of that movie. It's all about what happens in the in-between. Chapter 3, Moses gets the call with the burning bush, and then we have all the plagues, and that stuff is great. Another significant moment is in chapter 12, where the Passover is instituted. And this is the first time where there are calls to celebrate certain feasts at certain times. This is where we get a sense of a liturgical calendar, which is actually pretty important, and where people are then given more instruction about how they are to worship God. From that, we cross the Red Sea in chapter 14. Chapter 15, we start getting some of this quarreling. We get the manna, the bread of heaven. We also have the water from the rock. But we get the sense that the people aren't enjoying going through the wilderness, and there might be some issues. Chapter 20 is a big one because that's where we get the 10 Commandments. And chapters 21 through 23, we get more laws. We have to remember that a lot of times people think, what is the law? What's the 10 Commandments? Well, the 10 Commandments were meant to be a summary of the law, and all the other laws were meant to work in concert with that to help people understand how to live. And this is another really important thing. We have the law, and the law might not seem like a gift, but the law truly is a gift, because what the law signified was the fact that these people had a particular relationship with God, and from that particular relationship, there were particular expectations. I mean, we think about it, the people in our life who we love the most are folks of whom we have the most expectations and who we seek to live with in a particular way. And so this is a great gift, and we have to remember that. And so they get the law, and then there's some different things about the palace and the temple. One interesting thing, they talk about the tabernacle and it's moving. Oftentimes we think about Israel and we think about the people living in one place and being in one palace and having one temple. But in reality, for a majority of the history, they were moving around some way, somehow. And so, these descriptions about how they moved the tabernacle are descriptions that were actually quite accurate for much of the history. In chapter 32, we start getting some really, really big issues because we have the transgression of the golden calf. This is the first time that there was a major, major transgression or sin after the law was fully given. And they got punished. They got punished really, really hard. They were made to, Moses destroyed the golden calf and, burned it and put water with the ashes and made them drink that. So that's like poison. The Levites then took swords to their own people and killed thousands of their own people to kind of, to winnow it down or something like that. And then finally, they suffered through a horrible plague. Here's where you get the sense that the law is really important, and when you don't follow it, there are major consequences. And speaking of laws, that leads us to the third book that we started earlier this month in February, and that's Leviticus. That book literally means laws, and there's lots of laws about offerings. One thing about the offerings, you might say, what's the deal with all these offerings, all these sacrifices? I think about it this way. If you pay attention, so let's say you're sacrificing a goat, there are like the intestines and some fat and some fur and some different parts of the goat that actually get burned for the sacrifice, and the rest of it is left for the priests to eat. I think about that part of this was about an economy. I mean, the priests those days weren't just the folks who did the sacrifices or preached if people did that. They also functioned as doctors. They were also the literate people. Like, they served many functions that were critical for society. And so setting up these sacrifices so that they were able to get some grain and some meat because they weren't able to spend their time farming and keeping livestock, it makes sense to me. But that's a little bit about the offerings. Finally, towards the end of the reading that we just did yesterday and today, we run into Nadab and Abihu, who are two sons of Aaron, who were killed for unholy sacrifice. In chapter 11, we see for the first time clean and unclean foods. And in chapter 13, we're introduced to leprosy. And so that's what we've read so far. It's been pretty cool, and I hope that you've enjoyed it. Once again, if you were inspired maybe by annual meeting to start doing your Bible reading and you want to catch up and join us, feel free to watch this again to follow along a little bit and join us starting tomorrow, kicking off with Leviticus chapter 14. Either way, I hope this has been helpful. And if you see this and you're like, Edwin, I interpret this a different way, let me know and we can have dialogue. Speaking of dialogue, I'm looking forward to holding some spaces where any of us who are reading the Bible at any pace will get to talk. Most likely it'll be on Sundays during the Bible study hour at 10 o'clock. And so I'll have news about that in upcoming newsletters. But in the meantime, peace, love, and happiness. Happy Bible reading, and I'll see you.